of shows. Available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we're going to be starting our positional rankings for the week 11 of the NFL season. Can't believe we have made it this far. And on this list, a lot of interesting guys who you may have expected to be in this position where I'm saying, hey, you could potentially start them this coming weekend. And yes, a lot of it is down to matchups because that's always a factor in the world of fantasy football. But I do believe these guys are becoming more and more capable each week of making a name for themselves, not just in the fantasy world, but in real life. Some of these guys in this list, a lot of people may have expected how excellent they will be at this point of the season, and yet here they sit, me talking to you about them in glowing fashion. But without further ado, let's talk about this list, starting off with perhaps the most unexpected name on this list at this point in the season. Let's talk about Bo Nix, of all players, going up against the Falcons. Pretty interesting matchup, pretty favorable matchup for him, as I always point out in terms of looking for matchups in fantasy football. But this is actually a guy who I truly believe, and it sounds kind of funny saying it, can be a QB1. Maybe not this year, and you're maybe saying, okay, in a super flex league I can justify starting him. No, I think this is someone who we've seen improve before our eyes and just put in perhaps one of his best, if not his best performance of the season against the best defense in the National Football League, and was one blocked field goal away from beating them, giving them their first loss of the season. So think about that. Bo Nix, from where he was to start the season, a very erratic guy who looked a little bit uncomfortable, kind of forcing things a little bit in that Sean Payton system, to now is someone who I honestly would trust, not just in real life but in fantasy, to win me football games, and fantasy football games at that. 16.1 fantasy points against KC is nothing to sneeze at. It's a very impressive performance against that defense. And who's to say against the Falcons defense that has proven to be inept and susceptible to a lot of explosive plays this season, as we saw with Derek Carr. Bo Nix is someone who I feel can exploit defenses like this. Maybe the Broncos are not a playoff team just yet, and they're definitely in a division that potentially have two, if the Chargers look like the way they're looking. But Bo Nix is someone who I wasn't expecting to say could be a viable fantasy asset this week, and I'm glad that I'm able to talk about him in this way, because it just goes to show that you can continue to improve in this league and continue to get important reps and continue to understand certain systems. And that's what Bo Nix is proving right now. So I think he could be a very viable start this week for you against the Falcons pass defense that he could eat against. And then the next guy, another guy who's pretty unexpected, but is also in a very favorable matchup, still yet to play this week, Matthew Stafford, going up against the Pats. Now, the Pats did just shut down Caleb Williams and the Bears, but let's be real. The Bears had not scored a touchdown in about 20-odd possessions. So I can't say that the Bears' offense is comparable to what the Rams can bring to the table. And from where they were, sans Kupp and Nakua, to now, there's really a lot of hope. And tonight's game, it could come crashing down. It could fall off the rails because I still have hope for this Dolphins defense, but I still think that this Rams offense is just rounding into form and primed and ready to go for that playoff push in the NFC and NFC West. So, Matthew Stafford, I feel like, he's not as venerated or respected of a fantasy QB as a lot of people think. But he still is someone who, because of his offense and most importantly his system, can generate enough fantasy production to warrant a start week in, week out. And so, against the Pats defense that potentially is papering over some cracks, still not necessarily a defense that I think week in, week out could be the reason they're in football games. look for Matthew Stafford to potentially put up big numbers. And not for nothing, for him to potentially be a fantasy wild card for this stretch run here for the Rams. Because they're going to be one of the fun teams to monitor in not just the NFC West, not just the NFC, but in the entirety of the NFL. Just because of what Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua bring to the table. So, again, yes, it's kind of a matchup-oriented decision by me, on my part, but Matthew Stafford is still someone who I'll be looking at highly in terms of this stretch run, in not just real life, but in fantasy. And if you're a fantasy manager and he's still someone on the waiver wire, because he potentially could be, I would pick him up if I were you. Now, another guy who had a very, very abysmal game this weekend, but I still think in this matchup can come back to life, Sam Darnold against the Titans. Now, for some reason, the Vikings have not won as convincingly against these lower tier teams like the Colts and the Jaguars in the AFC South, and coming up against the Titans now. But the reason why I feel Sam Darnold this week is going to have a bounce back game is just because he's starting to trust more options, right? Because the beginning of the season, he didn't have a weapon as versatile as TJ Hawkinson. And as we saw in this game, not necessarily to the best of effects, but we saw a lot more short to intermediate routes in the middle of the field for Sam Darnold to make themselves available to. And so that's why I feel like a lot more can open up for Sam Darnold, despite the fact that this Vikings offense has kind of slowed down a little bit. Against the Titans, look for him to kind of pick up steam. 6.44 fantasy points against Jacksonville. Not necessarily his best performance, but I still think he holds merit in the world of fantasy football. As someone like a Bo Nix. Not a lot of people were expecting me to mention his name probably. Or for fantasy managers and players alike to be considering him highly. But I still think he's someone who, in certain matchups, and now that you know he can feel more comfortable throwing the football to TJ Hawkinson, can produce nice fantasy numbers for you. And it's not always going to be pretty for the Vikings. Nothing about this season is for them. Because no one expected them to be, at this juncture where they're second in the NFC North. But I feel like, they can gain momentum with this team and how they can play going forward because of what TJ Hawkinson brings to the table. So this kind of goes hand in hand with Sam Darnold and TJ Hawkinson. Do I think that it's something that I would immediately hang my hat on? No, because I still want to see a little bit more of their development as a QB tight end duo. But I still feel like it's an effective reason as to why Sam Darnold could improve and continue to show us what makes him great in these coming weeks. So that's why I feel like he'd be a viable start. And the last one, another simple one, going from GOAT to hero, Derek Carr versus the Browns, finding himself in my positional rankings after being on my sit list last week. And it's against the Browns. I know, this defense, especially the secondary, has been very topsy-turvy. Still one of the better secondaries in the league, right? But Derek Carr, I feel like his deep ball is his MO right now. And no matter how many wide receivers come in and out of that door, healthy or not, Derek Carr will always want to attack you in that manner. He always is looking for that deep shot. And he found a connection with MVS. We'll talk a little bit about him tomorrow and his unexpected rise. But he is just someone who is unflappable when need be. And this Browns team, they can still put up a fight, right? Because that's what Jameis Winston brings. He can still put up a fight. But let's be real here. They're not going to win many more football games this season. And so, even though the Saints are in just as awkward a situation, Derek Carr is still someone who can, with his deep ball, really be intriguing. I'm not saying you should immediately start him right away. Maybe this is a deeper league kind of play here. But he is still someone who, when given the chance, and is willing to take risks in certain games, in certain situations, is still someone who's got it, and got one trait that you could be excited about in terms of fantasy production, that deep ball of his. 26.46 fantasy points versus Atlanta. I know the Browns are a different test, but I still think he has a lot of sway here in terms of fantasy production. Because, like I said, I wasn't myself expecting him this week to show up like that. But if this interim's coaching staff believes that Carr can be effective enough to throw that deep ball, then why not do it and try it? And this could come back to bite me, but going from zero to hero right now is Derek Carr. But overall, when I look at these four players, man, how diverse of a list do we have this late in the season. Bo Nix, Darnold, Matthew Stafford, who has never been someone who was respected in fantasy circles as much, and Derek Carr, of all people. Now, this could be a list that, like I said, could raise some eyebrows, just because of, the risk with picking, say, a guy like Bo Nix, who is still in some ways a little bit erratic, and picking a guy like Sam Darnold, who's kind of regressed back to his Jets form. Sorry, Jets fans, but I had to mention it. And Matthew Stafford, someone who's never been a reliable option from a fantasy perspective throughout his career. But that just goes to show the depth of the QB position and how much trust I place in matchups and play, and style of play most importantly, from these guys. So that's why this list is so diverse. But let me know what you think in the comments about this list. If you have your own quarterbacks who you think can be viable starts and assets this week in fantasy football. But coming up to conclude the show after this short break, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. My bold fantasy football predictions for this upcoming week. We'll be right back to conclude the show